Okay, welcome everyone. I think everyone's in from the waiting room and connected to audio, if not visual. So welcome to this session of the World Literature and Translation Seminar Series. This is a seminar series that's co-convened by the Institute of Modern Languages Research at the University of London and by LINCS, which is the London Intercollegiate Network for Comparative Studies. And I'm sure you're all quite used to this type of session by now, but I'll just run through some of the kind of ground rules about the format of the session and how to ask questions. So you'll be able to ask questions in the chat. That's open now, and you can ask questions throughout the session, and I'll come back to those during the Q&A. What I'll do is I'll invite you to speak, to ask your question live. If you put your question in the chat. If you'd rather not ask a question live, then you're very welcome to direct your question to me in the chat, and then I can put that to our speaker on your behalf. This session is being recorded, so if you don't want to appear in the recording, then you can turn off your video now. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Vicky Young, and Vicky is the Kawashima Lecturer in Japanese Literature and Culture at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Languages at the University of Cambridge, and she's also a Fellow of Selwyn College. Vicky's currently writing a monograph that analyses works of fiction by writers from specific categories within Japanese fiction and what they might tell us about the ideas of world literature and translation within Japan. And Vicky has also just published an article in Japan Forum entitled Inciting the Past, Okinawan Literature and the Decolonizing Turn. Vicky's title today is Beyond Transborder on Translation and Difference in Contemporary Japanese Literature. And Vicky, I think you're going to speak for about half an hour. And then we'll have about half an hour, 40 minutes for questions, and then we'll wrap up the session. So I'll without further ado, I'll hand over to Vicky. Thanks, Vicky.
Thank you. Let me just get my technology sorted. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining in. It's really kind of impactful seeing a black wall of squares, but this is the world in which we're living. I also really want to thank Joe for this fantastic opportunity. I feel a bit cheeky because I didn't actually know that this series was running until late last year, and contacted Joe to find out more information. So it's a real honor, and I hope that we can have a mutually interesting and active discussion, certainly after I've given my presentation. I'm just going to share my slides with you all. And hopefully the first one's very boring, you'll see. Yes, Beyond Transborder on Translation and Difference in Contemporary Japanese Literature. I will say from the off that this is also building on an article which is forthcoming in the journal Japanese Languages and Literatures in March. So there will be a longer, probably more coherent written version available soon. But in the paper that I'm presenting here today, I'm going to offer a critical reading of a trend towards transborder literature, or ekkyo bungaku, that has gained ground within Japanese literary scholarship since the late 2000s, as a means through which Japanese fictions might connect with the world. I'll proceed in two parts. First, I'll highlight certain critical issues as I see them within the Japanese construction of transborder, or ekkyo. And second, I'll read a novel by the writer Tauda Yoko that presents an alternative view. Tauda may be familiar to some of you here. Tauda was born in Japan in 1960, moved to Hamburg in 1982, and has since produced a prolific body of work in Japanese and German to much popular and critical acclaim, and several of those works are available in English. The interest in transborder, or ekkyo, within Japanese academic circles can be traced back to the early 90s, however. The Okinawan cultural theorist and poet Ima Fukuryuta wrote in his 1991 book on the left, Creolism, the Heterology of Culture, that acts of cultural ekkyo, or transborder, border crossing, were, quote, bringing about great changes within hitherto fixed principles of place, territory, and boundary. In 1993, the writer Kyo Nobuko, on the right, an ethnic Korean born in Japan, published her recollections of visiting Korea as an adult under the title My Transborder Lessons, the Korean edition. Both writers invoke contexts, encounters, and explorations that could be deemed broadly colonial, post-colonial. I struggle with that term in the context of Japan, but in any case, Imafuku's primary focus is the poetry and writings of Chicana and Chicana poets and scholars, and his interpretation of ekkyo or transborder follows his reading of Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, La Frontera. But he also situates his ideas against Okinawa, where he comes from. Okinawa being Japan's southernmost prefecture, known today for its subtropical landscape, but whose history encompasses colonization by Japan, a devastating land battle fought on its soil in 1945, and its ongoing occupation by US military bases. As an ethnic or Zainichi Korean in Japan, Kyo Nobuko's work similarly juxtaposes questions of poetry, memory, and otherness against historical narratives of Japanese and, to some extent, US imperialism. However, transborder has gained new meaning since the late 2000s as a response to an increasing number of non-native writers of Japanese prose and Japanese writers who have become successful in languages other than their native tongue. And I've given a very rudimentary kind of who's who here. There are many more such writers, I hasten to add. So Levi Hideo on the left is an American-born writer, and he was the first non-Japanese writer to be nominated for the prestigious Akutagawa Literary Prize in 1996. Yang I is a writer from Harbin, learned Japanese as an adult and was the first non-Japanese to win this prestigious prize. Mizumura Minae has taught at Princeton and has written bilingual works in English and Japanese. And then Tauda, who I'll be talking about more, who writes in German and Japanese. I've chosen these four as well because these are the people who were kind of up and coming before this turn in the 2000s. So in his edited volume, Literature That Crosses Borders, which is the one on the left, published in 2009, so 1 year after Yang won the Akutagawa Prize, Tsuchiya Masahiko makes this shift of terminology explicit by explaining the rise of transborder literature in terms of increased international travel and domestic multiculturalism, which he argues are enabling texts and writers to traverse uncharted linguistic spheres and share in collective globalized experiences. Tsuchiya goes on to credit globalization with the emergence of a new world literature, wherein the national borders that delimit texts and cultures are being revised, overcome, and possibly erased. While maintaining the importance of writers deemed mainstream with a capital M, as he puts it, Tsuchiya hails transborder writers for transcending the territories of national literatures and demolishing the national view of language through their acquired foreignness. And the term that Tsuchiya uses for foreignness is ikyose, and kyo is the kyo of ekkyo, border. So his foreignness is a kind of other borderedness. Through what he describes as their polyphonic poetic pathos and intermingling collective cultures, Tsuchiya argues that transborder writers afford a different gaze through which to envisage new entry points into world literature. So here I want to highlight three central and interwoven challenges or complexities associated with this transborder turn. First, the excitement that transborder offers a new means of breaking down the boundaries of Japanese literature that assume agreement between a writer's nationality and the language of her text means turning a blind eye to history and the multilingual others that already exist within Japanese literature, among them ethnic Koreans, Okinawans, and other former colonial subjects. For while Tsuchiya's volume pays attention to post-colonial writing as a broad category per se, the focus of his contributors lies in the world beyond Japan, to Edouard Glissant, the Martinique-born writer of French, and to Chicana and Chicano writers, for example. He does include some writers of Japanese fiction, and they are Levy and Mizumura, the Swiss-born poet and novelist David Supetti, and Tauda Yoko. Second is a problem of language. On the slide, the central book cover there is a book titled Bilingual Japanophone Literature Between Multilingual and Multicultural, edited by Kakunaen. And it illustrates how transborder approaches have also enacted a shift in focus from Nihon bungaku, Japanese literature, to Nihongo bungaku, Japanese language literature. And I admit that I'm still working on the kind of the specificities and the relationship between this term, which might be translated as Japanophone, and related terms such as the francophone and the sinophone. There's a clear connection. I think there's a clear desire within the Japanese context to make that connection, but there are also significant points of difference, I would venture, which return us to the shape of the pre-war Japanese empire. In fact, the term Japanophone too was first coined by an ethnic Korean writer, Kim So-pom, in 1972. In this light, the exclusion of Japan's colonial others not only implies a bias against vernaculars that are not seen to constitute properly distinct languages from Japanese, i.e. the multilingual vernaculars spoken across Okinawa's islands, and arguably even Korean, it also makes plain how these terms are themselves being revised. A further, more contemporary slippage can be witnessed between Tsuchiya's book in 2009 that hails Tawada in a separate chapter as an exemplary Japanophone author on account of her bilingual productivity, and Kaku's definition of the Japanophone, which he foregrounds in terms of non-native writers of Japanese prose and writers from overseas, Kaigai kara no kakite, and of course, Tawada is a native writer of Japanese, if not a native writer of German. This brings me to the third challenge, the idea that transborder approaches may connect Japanese national literature to the world. Both Tsuchiya and his contemporary Numano Mitsuyoshi, which is the author of the third book, draw explicitly on the work of David Damrosch, in particular his 2003 book, What is World Literature, that suggests how works of world literature gain in value through translation. But in doing so, both betray a desire to promote Japan's national literature in a globalizing literary context. This dimension appears most saliently in an essay that Numano published in 2013 that traces the, quote, shifting borders of Japanese literature in terms of three processes of internationalization, which is his term. Oh, sorry. First, the worldwide successes of Murakami Haruki and the Nobel laureate Oe Kensaburo, whose fictions have moved, Numano says, from inside, i.e. inside Japan, to outside through their translation. Second, the new phenomena of bilingual writers consisting of Kawada, Mizumura, and Levy. And third, a younger generation who have come, quote, from outside to inside by choosing to write in Japanese of, quote, their own free will without the language having been imposed by irresistible force. This comment is as close as Numano seems to get in terms of kind of referring to the history of enforced linguistic assimilation that impacted so many writers within the Japanese Empire before 45. But the reference to internationalization also recalls policies of the same name that categorized Japan's efforts in the 1990s to reshape its politics, industry, and education in ways that might curry favor with Europe and the United States. In Marilyn Ivy's critique, internationalization, or to use the Japanese term kokusaika, these programs appeared to promote openness and cosmopolitan expansiveness, but in truth retained the national frame through, quote, the thorough domestication of the foreign, that is, that which goes from outside and comes from outside to the inside, and the dissemination of Japanese culture throughout the world, i.e. that which goes from inside to outside. Ivy writes, in the context of the political economy of culturalization, the once politically charged catchword of crossing the border turns into a depoliticized attitude of the mainstream society, referring to a phenomenon only attached to the colorful and entertaining surface of the economy of popular culture, and not necessarily including any basic political questions, such as institutional access, group interests, political rights, etc. The resonances between the context of which Ivy writes and the language used by Numano and his contemporaries suggests that to me that similar political questions might be asked here, both with a view to historicizing Japanese transborder efforts and decoding the motives that lie behind their apparent will to expand Japan's literary borders and promote Japanese texts in the world as a matter of national and cultural interest. Indeed, this transition within transborder approaches is also meant a departure from what the terms world literature and indeed translation mean in a strictly Japanese context. As Numano himself points out, world literature, which in Japanese is sekai bungaku, has traditionally meant foreign literature excluding Japanese texts. So we might draw a parallel with the English category of world music. Moreover, while translation in the Anglophone sense presumes a lateral movement across spaces and borders through the etymology of the prefix trans, the corresponding Japanese term honyaku derives its meaning from the verb hirugairu, that means to turn over, to flip over, to turn inside out. In order to visualize translation in this way, Tauda has been known during public readings of her work to turn a glove inside out. In Tauda's words, this romantic gesture makes it possible to show the flip side of something in an unexpected way. So the 3 points that I've very hastily sketched out here suggest how transborder approaches within Japanese literature are revising encounters with world literature as a designation that was historically regarded as something external or other, yet to which they now aspire. At the same time, the acceptance of a new model of world literature, whose roots and practices privilege the English language, runs the risk of abandoning the alternative conceptual possibilities that the Japanese language affords. This is particularly the case with texts that remain in situ, among them texts grounded in linguistic difference, whose global significance might therefore be overlooked if they're not translated in the Anglophone way. The question then arises, can a different approach to these problems enable more surprising flip sides of Japanese literature to emerge? So in my broader book project, I consider that this project is not only possible, but also necessary. For one, in the case of the text that I examined by Okinawan and ethnic Korean writers, their very exclusion from the mainstream transborder discourse threatens to remove them once and for all from this new global vision. My turn to Tauda here might therefore seem antithetical by comparison, given her reputation for crossing geographical, literary, and linguistic borders. Tauda has received numerous international critical accolades, and to date her work has generated at least 7 dedicated scholarly publications in 4 languages, not to mention miscellaneous single articles and special issues. In Doug Slaymaker's introduction to the most recent edited volume in English, he describes Tauda as one of the most important contemporary writers, not simply one of the most important Japanese or German writers. An online précis of a talk that David Damrosch was due to give in Tokyo last March also situates Tauda's, quote, global writing as being fundamental to tracing Japanese literature's entry points into the world. That's good. This reputation appears to be endorsed within Tauda's own work, including her definitive collection of essays, Exophony, A Trip Outside the Mother Tongue, which was coincidentally published in the same year as David Damrosch's What is World Literature, 2003. Exophony is not Tauda's coinage, but she was attracted to the term due to its fresh evocation of a kind of symphony that is at once the norm, tsujo, within all literature, and yet also brimming with the adventure, curiosity, and creativity of writing outside the restraints of one's mother tongue. The book is structured around a series of critical vignettes on topics of linguistic exile and movement and literary creation, headed with the name of an international city that assumes the role of a virtual background to the debate. And that is followed by a shorter second series titled Adventures in the German Language. Tauda writes both as a scholar, she has a PhD from the University of Zurich, and as a creative practitioner, and poetically likens herself to a fish who perswimbulates, so she uses she makes a verb out of swimming and walking at the same time, who perswimbulates the seas and feels the linguistic situation of various lands with my scales. In Japanese, the book has been lauded for its cosmopolitan playfulness and carefree prose that emulate the author's distinctive characteristics and travels. However, Tauda's writing also eschews the utopian associations of transborder movement in multiple creative ways. Her protagonists frequently appear motionless, stammering, even wounded. As Brett de Barry has written, these motifs do not invoke parables of crossing so much as thematize the violent process of boundary production. In Exophony, this means not only rejecting claims to a stable identity based on geographic or linguistic terrain, but also foregrounding the unsettling exophonic state of being a foreigner into one's own tongue. And I kind of hate doing this when it's trying to kind of explain Japanese grammar to people who are not familiar with it potentially. But this subtitle, which I previously said was kind of a trip outside the mother tongue, it can be interpreted in two different ways. The ambiguity of this NO, this not, which is a kind of possessive, it's almost like an apostrophe S. But also because in Japanese, you tend not to say I in a sentence, you tend to avoid referring to oneself. So it has this potential double meaning as a trip in which I go outside of the mother tongue, but also a trip in which the mother tongue goes outside of itself. So this defamiliarizing process, which is a little more disturbing. Moreover, we might draw a parallel between Tabari's idea of boundary production within Towder's works and her bilingual writing practice overall, which implies an inherited translatability that might lead towards its global visibility, and yet, as Bettina Brandt asserts, also ensures that few can read her oeuvre in its entirety. Indeed, while the term exophony has become hugely important to the transnational critical field concerned with Towder's work, and you see it appearing in all sorts in all the multilingual scholarship on her. To my knowledge, the first translation into Korean of the full text, was into Korean, and that only appeared in 2019. So in other words, the term's usage exceeds the implied readership of the text. Besides explicating her deconstructive approach to language, exophony offers a critical and historicized exposition of contemporary transborder trends. In the book's early pages, Towder recalls her dismay upon witnessing the mass consumerism of Japanese tourists in Germany in the 80s, and the rise in Japanese enrollments into French and English language classes following the collapse of Japan's bubble economy in the early 90s. And that's the context in which Marilyn Ivy was writing, or about. For Towder, such aspirations reveal Japan's deep-seated inferiority complex in relation to Europe, spurred by its ideological colonization by some abstract Western authority. Although some might protest that one can learn French simply because it's fun and crave French food because it's delicious, Towder counters that these trends cause damage because they leave the intertwined historical legacies of, quote, Eurocentrism and twisted national purism untouched beneath the 10,000 yen note. Elsewhere, in the book, she highlights the dark shadow cast by Japanese colonization within Asia and its role in, quote, imposing exophony upon its neighboring countries, perspectives that I argue are missing from these contemporary approaches. These reflections lead her to the border and the anticipation that translation, especially into a European language like English, has become the hallmark of international success. I have to go back. So this is a quote from the text. She says, I don't wish to cross the border. I want to reside within it. There is something more important than language in that moment of hesitation, a sense that I can truly feel the border. It would be tedious if the world was submerged in some boring, shallow business English that can be transmitted anywhere. I do not mean to speak ill of English or place French on a pedestal, but that moment is important in which the strange regionality unique to a place thickens. And that's precisely what develops the urge to cross the national border. There are echoes here of Derrida's monolingualism of the other, kind of there, I speak only one language, there's only, I forget the precise quote. But by distinguishing here between the border, kyokai, and the national border, kokkyo, Towder reveals the border itself can be multiple and varied. And in so doing, she makes possible an alternative scenario in which not every act of translation, at least in the transborder sense, is transgressive. So the Japanese novel Tabiosuru Hadaka no Me and its German counterpart Das nackte Auge illustrate this alternative view. Both books were published in 2004 and marked the first occasion for Towder to release self-penned works in both languages simultaneously. It's also the first full-length novel that she produced after writing Exophony. The narrative is ostensibly the same in both, although I shall return to the difference in their titles. The story is told in the first person and follows a young Vietnamese girl who travels to Berlin in 1988 to represent the, quote, raw voices of victims of US imperialism at an all-nation youth conference on behalf of her school in Ho Chi Minh City. On the night before the conference, however, the narrator is kidnapped by a young man named Jörg who takes her to his hometown, Bochum. She escapes by stowing away on a night train that she believes will take her to Moscow, only to discover that she is bound instead for Paris. The revelation causes, quote, everything before my eyes to turn black. And it's this blindness that prefigures the narrator's status as an illegal immigrant forced to hide from the French authorities. As she finds shelter in the darkness and virtual spaces of the cinema, in particular the films of French actress Catherine Deneuve, the novel hinges on the mutually implicated aspects of visuality and visibility that shape the narrator's ambiguous existence as an unseen eye and an unseeing eye. The question of what the narrator sees is raised by the juxtaposition of her narrative against Deneuve's on-screen performances. Towder's novel unfolds in 13 chapters, each of which marks the passing of a subsequent year from 1988 to 2000, and whose titles borrow from Deneuve's films, and you get this double temporality with the release dates of the films as well. In the opening paragraph of the novel, the narrator details the closing scenes of Roman Polanski's 1965 thriller Repulsion. Deneuve plays Carol, a Belgian woman who suffers a psychological and ultimately murderous breakdown while living alone in London. At the film's close, Deneuve, or Carol, lies unresponsive as the camera pans from her vacant stare across the room strewn with objects before zooming in on the glare of a young girl in an old family photograph. So the family photograph kind of zoomed in is on the right. The picture on the left is not the final scene of Deneuve, but it's a scene within the film. And throughout the whole film, Polanski's playing with Deneuve and kind of visuality, and she's always looking slightly kind of off and glancing off to direction. She doesn't really see things. As recounted in Towder's text, Carol's projected eye sees nothing. Before it is overlain with the girl's eye in the photograph, that too becomes increasingly blurred as the camera zooms in. In short, vision in the film is unstable, even absent. In fact, this is kind of carried through to the novel, because despite only seeing this film, quote, in a cinema in Paris 1 year later, the narrator begins to suffer the same visual delusions while being held captive in Germany, as those which Carol experiences in the film. While this opening scene positions the narrator as a spectator through her recollection that, quote, this was the first film in which I saw you, it also interpolates Deneuve and the role she plays into a fraught dialogue in which the narrator internalizes those multiple troubled modes of blindness and misseeing. Comparing the pronouns that constitute this dialogue also helps to illustrate how differences manifest in Towder's German and Japanese versions. So in Japanese, the speaker can choose from multiple personal pronouns according to their status in relation to their addressee. The narrator of Towder's Japanese work refers to herself as watashi, a neutral, if slightly formal, first person, which is befitting for female speakers, but not necessarily, it's not obligatory, it's not steadfast. And she addresses Deneuve as Anata, a term that has a degree of formality, but really denotes familiarity. And in my Japanese textbook, it was always translated as you dear, or something like that. By contrast, the German text writes ich, a pronoun empty of signifiers connoting gender and age, and the formal second person pronoun sie, which is rendered strikingly in full capitals throughout the text. While the Japanese dialogue generates a degree of intimacy between these two characters, then the German seems to move them apart, or at least hold them at a distance. In English, the lowercase ich and capitalized sie is also inverted as uppercase I and lowercase u, and the book has been translated based on the German text by Susan Bonowski, and I'll come back to that. A further critical paradox produced by Towder's two originals is that each has generated its own interpretive paradigm. Japanese literary scholars, for example, have foregrounded questions of visual ambiguity, technologies of cinema, and spectatorship. While in German scholarship, the narrative tends to emerge as one of movement, even though it is the Japanese title that refers to a traveling naked eye, not the German title. Of course, both of these perspectives are incredibly relevant and necessary, but their differences compound the challenges for analyzing a novel against existing critiques produced themselves within specific area and language-based disciplines. The existence of multiple texts broadens critical possibilities and international discourse, but Towder's simultaneous production of two texts in two languages means that they neither follow a traditional schema of an original and its translation, nor can they be reconciled into a single version. As a result, this strategy creates the conditions by which both versions do not absolutely align, but they glance off each other, much like the narrator's oblique gaze that never quite sees Deneuve. There is so much to be said on the dynamics of the gaze in this film, in terms of film theory, and indeed the relationship between the Vietnamese colonial subject desiring the French mother/motherland, portrayed by Deneuve. But I'll skip to a much later scene in which the narrator agrees to rectify her immigration status by obtaining a fake Japanese passport, traveling to Thailand to marry a fellow Vietnamese expatriate, and legally returning as his wife. Having stowed into Paris illegally from a former colony and communist country, the narrator is starkly aware of her difference from the wealthy Japanese tourists in the city. For her, Japan symbolizes a nation beset with, quote, the contradictions of capitalism, which recalls Tauder's critiques in her earlier essay, and a former colonial administration of Indochina that she perceives as more destructive than the French. Yet this is why Japanese is the only identity by which she must learn to pass. With the help of a black market dealer, whose nickname Heron, as in the bird, conceals a cryptic pun on the Japanese name for this bird, which is sagi, which is homophonic with the word meaning fraud, she obtains a fake passport, and her fiancé buys her monogrammed designer fashions that make her look like a Japanese woman. Despite these efforts, however, the narrator fails to pass through Charles de Gaulle Airport and is detained by border control inspectors. Thereupon, Jörg, the guy who kidnapped her at the beginning, catches up with her and takes her once more back to Germany. Back in captivity, the narrator's memory of her past resurfaces as, quote, misery itself. Chastised by Jörg for wearing dirty, worn-out sandals made from tires, a reference that appears to point to Deplop, the sandals associated with Viet Cong fighters, the narrator's voice grows increasingly fragmented until she chooses to forget the past by, quote, poking out my eyes with the second hand of the clock. This violence implies the novel's climax, but it is followed by a short closing chapter interwoven with Lars von Trier's 2000 film Dancer in the Dark. Told in the third person, the chapter introduces Selma, whose character is portrayed in von Trier's film by the Icelandic singer Björk. And Selma is a Czech immigrant in Berlin, and her so introduces Selma and her blind neighbor, who despite her, quote, gray hair streaked with blonde and European appearance, claims to be Vietnamese. As this blind woman explains that she lived in Paris for 10 years, but lost her sight trying to save a young foreign girl who was stabbed to death in Alexanderplatz in 1988, she uncovers an alternative story in which the narrator of the preceding chapters was murdered on the night she arrived in Berlin. As this narrative coda casts a ghostly shadow over the preceding chapters, the blind woman embodies this liminality through the superimposition of her professed Vietnamese roots and her looks that replicate Deneuve's iconic status. This twist exposes the possibility that the narrator never left Berlin and only her eye traveled. It also allows the reader to see the narrator for the first time in the glimpse of her sandals and then in the eye that she pierces. Rather than foreclose the narrator's ability to see once and for all, this act of self-blinding forces the reader to witness this Vietnamese woman within the Japanese and indeed German text. Having been concealed and overlain by Deneuve's cinematic appearances, here the narrator inserts herself back into the story. As the blind woman explains, and this is the quote on the slide, you see, vision is like a tear. It's not that one can see through the tear, but rather that vision is the tear. That's precisely why it can't be seen. The Japanese term used here meaning a tear or a rift, sakeme, contains the character for eye within it. So that's the third, the kind of rectangle, vertical, kind of split into three. Through this idiomatic use of the eye, like the eye of a needle, the image of the narrator blinding herself does not put an end to vision, but opens out towards new modes of seeing. This will sound like a non sequitur, but Schrödinger's cat names a famous thought experiment in which a cat is confined to a box and may or may not be killed by radiation poisoning. In the creative rendition of the visual artist Hito Steil, a Japanese-German artist, as long as the box remains sealed, it contains two cats, one dead, one alive. I know theoretical physicists get annoyed with this interpretation, but it's an artist's interpretation. It is only when one looks inside the box that the answer is resolved. So if the act of looking in here in Schrödinger's cat ends the state of indeterminacy in which it's not known whether the cat is poisoned or survives, Tauder's novel deals the opposite blow. The narrator's self-blinding opens her narrative to multiple, uncertain, and even contradictory possibilities. The ambiguous climax to Tauder's novel recalls its presence in two originals and the problem of world literature. As already noted, to date, only Das nackte Auge has been translated. I've put the English copy there, but it's also been translated into French and other languages, including Vietnamese. But these translations often transport Tauder's novel into the world, bound in covers that identify it as a work translated from the German. And the French version is within a series, Literatur Allemande. As they do, they erase the Japanese text from global sight. Even though Tauder's marketability continues to rise, there is surely little commercial justification for publishing a second translation of a somewhat recent text already in circulation, especially when the author herself continues to produce new works. Like its narrator who fails to travel on a Japanese passport, Tauder's Japanese traveling naked eye is left before the border while its counterpart crosses instead. However, Tauder's text in double fights against these effects of translation that contain and erase by forcing open a more radical space between the two texts. On her visa application to study in Paris, the narrator uses a pseudonym, Tu Fong. As a false name that I have not yet used, the choice seems arbitrary. However, the narrator draws attention to this alias when she signs it again on a school application form and muses, "When I wrote Tu Fong, I had the feeling that I was writing about someone else." Almost spookily, this is the name of the translator of the 2011 Vietnamese translation of Das nackte Auge. But it also invokes the writer Duong Thu Phuong, who in 1989, the year in which Tauder's narrator arrives in Paris, was expelled from the Vietnamese Communist Party after speaking out against the corruption and elitism of its leadership. In 91, Duong was arrested and imprisoned without trial under the charge of smuggling secret documents. Following intervention from Amnesty International, Duong was freed after 7 months, and in 1994 she travelled to Paris. Although offered political asylum in France, Duong refused and returned to North Vietnam, where her passport was withdrawn and a ban was imposed on publishing her novels. Duong's third novel, The Paradise of the Blind, was published in 1988, the year in which Tauder's novel begins, and tells the story of Hang, a bright young Vietnamese woman who is studying in Russia. When a telegram arrives summoning her to join her sick and demanding Uncle Chin in Moscow, Hang is obliged by her mother, Qing's only sibling, to make the journey. As she boards the night train, Hang reminisces about her childhood and the land reforms that occurred between 1953 and 56 that tore up her country and family. Owing to the book's scathing depictions of these land reforms, The Paradise of the Blind was withdrawn from publication in Vietnam, but in 2001, it became the first Vietnamese novel to appear in translation in the United States. By writing Tu Phuong, Tauder's narrator therefore opens a space into which the life and work of this literary namesake writes back. This leads to myriad textual coincidences, especially when Hang observes, quote, "Japanese. The name alone was like a certificate of respectability, a passport that opened all the doors in the world." From here, one sees scenes and spaces left outside of Tauder's narrative frame come into view, of the Vietnam that her narrator left behind and the journey that might have been had she boarded the Trans-Siberian line bound from Moscow as she'd intended, and not headed to Paris. The central narrative strands and characters of Duong's novel describe the oppression suffered by Vietnam under its foreign colonizers and national leaders alike. Reading this work through the lens of Tauder's, one finally uncovers the raw voice of victims of US imperialism, i.e. the title of the speech that the narrator loses on her arrival in Berlin, and thus an alternative means of imagining textual connections not based on crossings, but on textual inversions and peering through the gaps. I had a little bit of a narrative coda, but I think I'm going to draw a line there because I fear that I probably talked a bit longer than I was going to. So that's where I'll draw a line, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for such a rich and fascinating paper. And we can give you a virtual round of applause. I'm sure a Zoom round of applause, we're all very used to it now. But yeah, thank you. Thank you. What I'm going to do is just remind people that the chat is open. If you would like to ask a question of Vicky directly, then you can either write in the chat or you can raise your digital hand or let me know in the chat that you'd like to put a question to Vicky. I'll just let people perhaps gather their questions and give Vicky a bit of a break as well. I'll try and articulate a question that I have, particularly around transborder and the use of that term and the engagement with that term. And I just wondered whether, I mean, why transborder, I suppose, is my question. And why, you mentioned the national, why not transnational? What is it about the Japanese context? And I think there's, it's kind of linked to that question. You mentioned creolism and
yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, so a kind of dual question, if you like, about transborder. I wanted to ask you about where the kind of archipelago comes in here, and whether we get into conversations about archipelagic thinking that we might associate with the Caribbean, or perhaps even the Pacific and kind of the islands of the South Pacific. So that's a big open-ended question, Vicky.
No, that's fine. I mean, I can actually kind of feed that into part of the things that I was thinking about in terms of my coda.
Okay.
To come to your second question, the second part of your question first. Yes. So Imafuku, who I spoke of, who's the author of this book, Creolism. He is very into this I never said that out loud, and there's a reason why, because I obviously can't. Archipelagic thinking. So he actually, one of his book titles is also Guntoron, which is Theories of the Islands. And I have read one study which actually uses that Imafuku's work on islands in relation to reading Tawada. So she has a story called, now I'll get the publication history wrong here, but it was first titled kind of the wounds in the alphabet, and the narrator is a Japanese woman who ends up on a Canary Island and is translating Anna Duden's the Wundpunkt im Alphabet or something like that, and struggling to do so. The title was then changed. It's now translated as the literal translation is transplanting letters. But yes, there's ways of kind of connecting this, and so there are these island themes within Tawada's text as well, and I've seen it be this idea of island thinking and archipelagos in that context. I'm thinking about Imafuku really in terms of the transborder at the very beginning. So to come back to your first part of your question, I am at risk in the way that this is framed of kind of overselling the use of, it's not that kind of everyone's been banging on about transborder. It seemed to kind of be a very important thing around the time when Tsuchiya was publishing in 2009, and there were lots of different articles, and I saw this term quite a lot. Then it seems to shift. So actually the term seems to evolve, and we get more towards the Japanophone. I think it's interesting that, as I say, Japanophone in one of the main books on that form, although Japanophone is still used to talk about, I see Jeffrey's popped up, as kind of as writers writing in both directions, and kind of, but it just was conspicuous to me that one of the leading or main books that comes out about Japanophone makes it explicit that this is writers coming from outside into Japanese. And then kind of world literature seems to be kind of catching all of these terms in a certain way as well. Numano's book that I introduced at the beginning was published, so it's this book from 2020. It's actually a collection of articles and essays that he's published over a period of time. So it's not a single book that he's just penned. But in here, one of the last essays that he includes, and I think it's kind of notable that it's at the last, is kind of returning to transborder. And he talks about Tawada and exorphony in that context, and says that this is the way forward for transborder interaction. I suppose so. The kind of I'm still trying to join up all of these various dots. I think the other thing though to point out then is that for whatever reason, the framing of, I think the language that underpins the transborder inquiries as it was begun is still carrying through the explorations of Japanophone and world literature, even if it's not called transborder. There's kind of permutations. What's interesting with what Nuano is talking about, really since I think 2012, but still talking about is the idea then that a kind of a new interpretation of world literature, still very much influenced by Damrosch, thinking about modes of reading and text gaining value in translation, but also talking about the effects of the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown on March the 11th, 2011. And so in this book, he reads, and I've seen elsewhere, he reads Emily Apter's work on the translation zone, where she kind of just talks about 9/11 as a failure of translation. And Numano says, can we expand on this idea of an incommensurable event related to a failure of translation? Can we talk about the incommensurability of 3/11, as 11th of March is sometimes colloquially referred, as itself a moment of translation that kind of creates a temporal rupture between before 3/11 and after 3/11, and that actually might allow us to have a post 3/11 world literature. This does multiple implications. On the one hand, the idea of a transborder or kind of connection is now replaced with translation as a temporal point of rupture, and what he's meaning there is not only texts that are written explicitly with the events of the catastrophes of 3/11 in mind, but also the ability to read kind of text published before 3/11 retrospectively from the perspective of the disaster. And of course, that has really fascinating possibilities and implications there as well. What's interesting, so in the longer article of the version of this paper, is that you might think, well, what on earth is where would a text like The Traveling Naked Eye or The Naked Eye feature in this? But I think it comes through the Vietnamese presence within it. So I mean, today Vietnamese are the third largest migrant community in Japan, and there are a huge number of Vietnamese laborers who've been brought into Japan to help with the cleanup operation in Fukushima. So if this can work in those ways to highlight those kind of social concerns and those kind of others within Japanese literature, I think that's fantastic. But I worry that the way that it's being constructed at the moment is potentially favouring other things. And of course, this is not about the reputation of a single author. Tauda's, if anything, her reputation and her writing has become even more renowned and acclaimed since 3/11. She's written some fantastically provocative and critical pieces in the wake of the catastrophe. But I'm more interested in their overall structure and how this is shaping the face that Japanese literature puts out into the world in one respect. So I've kind of gone off in multiple tangents. I don't know if that was in any way useful, but this is where this is also heading to, I guess. So the transborder is not the full stop. I'm trying to think of this in terms of the use these texts in order to see what's going on with the mechanisms and structures as they're currently being articulated.
No, absolutely, and that comes across very clearly. Thank you, Vicky. If I'm inviting people to kind of dive in. If you'd like to ask a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself if you can't find the raise hand button. I think these days it's located in depending on which version of Zoom you've got, it's located in the participants section or the reaction section, I think, at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to, if you can't find that, just unmute yourself. If you have a question that you'd like me to put to Vicky, then I can just remind you to post it in the chat. It's interesting, Vicky. I mean, in terms of that question of looking at Fukushima, I mean, I wanted to ask you. I mean, I don't know an awful lot about this at all, but I just wanted to ask you about whether there were. I mean, in terms of the tradition of, these days we are thinking a lot. We are thinking of world literature in the context of environmentalism, in the context of the environmental humanities. I just wondered whether there was a big focus on that post Fukushima, and whether that had, how much that had kind of given rise to that kind of body of literature.
I mean, I'm not. Yes, I mean, the short answer is yes, and I think there's a lot of kind of eco-critical narratives being produced. There's a lot of there's almost indications of an animal turn going on in post-Fukushima works. It's not been my sole area of research. I mean, so I'm kind of reluctant to speak on that particular side as too much of an expert when it's not my complete field, and there are people who've done a lot more work on this. But yes, I think I mean we cannot deny the impact that it had on filmmakers and literature and art since 2011 in Japan, not just produced by Japanese artists and writers, but also in response to it, and the kind of the global significance of those catastrophes, which I mean are still ongoing in many respects. Certainly the nuclear fallout and things like that. And we do see a shift towards kind of ethical and sociological concerns, perhaps, in literature as well. What interests me, and this is potentially where it's a bit kind of, I struggle to articulate because it's a bit provocative, perhaps, but I think it's just made the other things a little bit more difficult to see. So, through the 90s and early 2000s, we did see, to take a look at translation as an example, that was a period in which we saw anthologies of Okinawan fiction, ethnic Korean fiction, Taiwanese writers, and all that kind of thing. And that seems to have kind of peaked and then disappeared. And of course, there are people translating these texts. There are people, many scholars working on these ideas. But it seems that, with my Okinawan friends, Fukushima actually was not really that significant to them because they didn't feel it. I mean, obviously in a huge national kind of sense, it was a huge emergency. But I went to Okinawa a week later, and of course people were escaping to Okinawa because it was business as usual. So there's kind of the geography. I mean, it's a huge country, right? And there's all of these different perspectives, and I do wonder to what extent it would be wrong to say that post Fukushima there's been a focus on the national, because that's not the case. I think there's really a focus on the affected region directly in the northeast. And there's a fantastic Japanese scholar, Takahashi Tetsuya, who actually compares Fukushima and Okinawa in terms of colonization. And of course, this is a region where it's kind of being used for as the site for nuclear power plants. And if you read Furukawa Hideyo's Horses, there's all of these questions and situations of kind of ways in which these places are distant from the metropole and therefore overlooked. So it's not just that it's kind of Japanese literature has just become about the center. What's interesting in Towada's literature since 311 is that she often satirizes so some of her short stories satirize the idea that kind of Japan becomes increasingly closed off. So I also find it interesting. There's one story where kind of almost North Korea and Japan are flipped, and Japan is the kind of place which has no access. People can't get out because of the association with radiation. And I just find that really interesting. Kind of what's happening when a writer who is at the forefront of discourse on kind of global, transborder, international, whatever it might be, who's writing texts that are of a Japan that's increasingly closed off, and that the borders are increasingly difficult to overcome. So I think that these are the kinds of tensions that I've been thinking about. That was a bit of a waffle, but
Not at all, no. And I think it's clear how, you know, an event like that has kind of repercussions on everything, you know, in terms of thinking about movement, movement especially, as you're saying. There is a question in the chat, Vicky. I don't know if you've seen it. This is from Amber. I don't know if, Amber, you'd like to come on and ask a question live. If you prefer not to, I can read it out for you.
Wait, no, sorry, so you're talking.
Amber, are you there? Wants me to read out. No problem. So you mentioned the way that the other is represented in Japanese literature today and how it's not quite as it should be. This is what the questionnaire is inferring. But then you focused on how Tawada doesn't fall into that trap and never really specified in what ways this representation is still lacking today with other authors. Could you maybe expand a little on that, Vicky?
Yeah, let's see if I've understood it correctly. So I mean, I talking about Tauda in this context is a little bit of a strategy. I'm going to come at it this way. So when I was writing my PhD, and this still carries through, I was looking at an Okinawan author, an ethnic Korean author, and Tauda. And the response that I would get when I was talking about these three authors together in Japan was, I get the Okinawan and the ethnic Korean together, but Tauda's different. You can't talk about Tauda in the same context, which I think is a disservice to both. I think so. The root of all of this is trying to find a language with which to talk about different writers, irrespective of the specific categories with which they're seen to be bound. And the more I kind of was thinking through these questions, so I look at a writer called Sakiyama Tami, who's Okinawan, and she really pushes the limits of language, and that's using multiple scripts in Japanese. She uses multiple vernaculars from Okinawa, but they're not even really true Okinawan vernacular either. She kind of makes it, she invents it. If anybody's read Martin Eve's book on close reading with computers, it's that kind of, it looks Okinawan, but if you actually tested it against, it doesn't stand the test of being authentically Okinawan. And in fact, she completely kind of rejects the idea that a pure Okinawan vernacular either exists or should be desirable, much in the same way that Tauda is interrogating the nature of the Japanese language and what it kind of can signify. So I was really interested in how these three writers were using similar strategies, and in Sakiyama's case, she's really deconstructing the boundaries of what Okinawan literature can be and how it's kind of contained its expectations. And I don't think that the answer was then to say, well, Tauda is transborder, because I think the transborder comes with a similar kind of restrictions as a category. I think every attempt to kind of categorize language kind of will always, the promise of inventing new categories is always curtailed in a way by what they need to contain and therefore exclude. And so I'm trying to kind of think about how do you find a language with which to talk about all of these writers, irrespective of whether they're seen as transborder or international or minor or marginalized or whatever it might be. And so it's really thinking about those lines that have been drawn. The question about then you focused on how Tauda doesn't really fall into the trap. I mean, it's partly a strategy. So Tauda, I think, actually has, I think all of the appraisals about Tauda are very, very positive and very informative. I'm just trying to come at it from a different angle and see if we can kind of continue to boost what her text can signify. And I do think it's interesting how the idea that translation becomes part of this narrative, or at least her appearance in multiple languages becomes part of her narrative. And if that gets embroiled within a world literature that seems to be structured around, but still limited within the categories of national literature, then there's a tension there. And I think, ironically, Tauda is the one to tease that tension out, precisely because of her position within all of these things, be that as a writer who, according to certain definitions of Japanophone, is not Japanophone because she's a native writer of Japanese, or whether it's to do with, and of course, how she's received in German is also a different thing altogether.
Yeah. I think, no, thank you, Vicky. That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, some of the works that, I mean, we could chat forever about this. There's some of the works that I've been working on in North Africa do, go through similar kinds of self-reflexive processes in terms of the types of language that are used to categorize these writers. I'm gonna move on to another question. We've got another question in the chat, and I'm just going to invite Nina. If you'd like to come and ask your question, you're very welcome to come live. If you can unmute.
Sure. Can you hear me?
We can indeed. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to thanks so much for this great talk. You were talking a bit about the great influx of foreign residents in Japan post 3/11 and the tendency for certain foreign speakers, generally not those from Southeast Asia and the Pacific, to be incorporated in this, or to form this sort of discourse of the Japanophone literature. I've also noticed in the art world in Japan an increased interest in Japan's place within the ASEAN sort of group of different countries that imagines Japan as the head of this more island-based, with asterisks, of course, island-based region, tying into this image in Japan, the self-image in Japan of the country as a, quote, small island nation. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about this politics of borders, either its potentials, its drawbacks, or how you sort of understand it. You seemed very, it seemed like there was a lot that you wanted to potentially say about that you didn't necessarily have time to get to in the talk. So I would like to hear more about that.
I'd be very happy to. Can you just repeat part of your question? Because I was slightly distracted I distracted myself, I should say, with something in the chat. But which part in particular was that? Sorry.
Yeah, so just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this sort of politics of borders within the Japanophone literature, the discourse of Japanophone literature. But I guess I'm especially thinking about the fact that while it's sort of focused on things that are being written in Japan, it's also something about Japan placing, the discourse is placing Japan within an international context in a very particular way. So what are the politics that it's pulling out?
Yeah, I mean, this is really part of the exploration. So I kind of do have lots of things to say, but whether they're coherent or articulate or founded is part of the adventure and the kind of moment of discovery that I'm going through. I mean, I have the bilingual Japanophone. I think it's such an interesting title, bilingual Japanophone. I don't even know what this kind of what is the adjective doing there. And yes, so Levy makes an appearance in Mizumura and Yang E. So I think that, it's. I don't want to have that tone in my voice, but there is the same kind of people who seem to be there, and I think there's so much more to this. So that's part of it. Is kind of trying to create that space in which people who. I mean, this is partly the categorization. In terms of the borders, I mean, I do think that they're therefore kind of still being eked out, and this book does actually have some kind of ethnic Korean stuff in it, but not very much. It also has one Okinawan writer, but who's compared alongside Levy Hideo. There's another tension to this. So I mentioned that world literature in the Japanese context has traditionally meant literature that is not Japanese. And it was traditionally literature that was translated from, so I've got kind of old debates by literati, like writers and stuff in kind of 30s and places and times like that, when, they're really talking about French literature first and foremost. And I mean, there's another really interesting parallel that this whole novel of Towers takes place in Paris, which is so central to a lot of kind of world literary studies. You think about Pascal Casanova and all of these kinds of things. That's a mountain I'm yet to chip away at. But there are a few kind of collected anthologies or complete works of world literature that have been published in Japan. And in 2006, I think, as well as I can identify, because there's a limit to what I really need to go and see the books for myself. And it's very difficult navigating all of this sometimes online. There are only 3 Japanese writers of Japanese prose included in this anthology. One is an Okinawan writer, Midori Shun. One is who draws a lot on Faulkner and Garcia Marquez. One is a Zainichi, an ethnic Korean writer called Kim Talsu. And the other is a female writer, Ishimura Michiko, who passed away a couple of years ago and was a kind of campaigner and a journalist, as well as a writer of beautiful poetic prose in response to the Minamata disease disaster, which is, I mean, it was kind of, there was a company pouring mercury into the rivers, and it started out where the cats had this dancing cat disease, and there was a lot of pollution and kind of fallout from that. So those are the 3 writers of Japanese prose included in the completed works. So in a way, to have some of the Zainichi, the ethnic Korean stuff in the contemporary book, it's not to say that it's not there entirely, but it also carries the legacy of having been the former category of world literature, which was not Japanese. So that's a tension that hasn't quite been pulled out, I don't think. Yeah, this idea of borders, I mean, I don't want to say this, the will to categorize seems to be just there all the time. And it's really hard to talk about writers without categorizing or without kind of appending some descriptor. So I suppose this whole project is my kind of voyage towards trying to talk about things without talking about them or something, and just finding language that's not language or kind of doesn't confine in the same way. And that's why I think, you know, kind of looking at the roots of Japanese etymologies and things like that is potentially useful. And also I think that the world literature then paradigm and kind of these borders, you know, we talk about world literature, it's often narrated as something that comes out of globalization post kind of 89, post kind of Cold War and all of that kind of global historical context. The other important thing is that 1989 is the year that Hirohito died. And that is obviously a very significant moment within Japan's national history, obviously wider implications as well. So I think there's also a legacy, there's something to do with Hirohito here, or the kind of the legacies of that Showa era, because the 90s then becomes a time in which we do get these voices from the margins. We do get former so-called comfort women, these women who weren't all Korean, but a large number were, who were forced into sexual slavery for the Japanese military. And that's where you see the rise of kind of concerns, kind of drawing on post-colonial theories. And this is the kind of thing that Imafuku is also looking at. But then it kind of dies down. And I just want to know where it went. But Jeffrey has a great comment, so I want him to come in.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, Jeffrey, you're very welcome to come in. I mean, it links nicely your question to what Vicky's just been talking about.
Yeah. Actually, that was really nice. You already began to answer my question, I think.
Didn't I read it at the same time? So I thought I'll start just saying what you were going to say.
Yeah. I wrote in the chat, and I mean, it's there for people to see. But yeah, I've been really interested in Ekkyo Bungaku, as you know, someone who does translation and writes in Japanese myself. I've been really struck by how, at least in our kind of recent conception of what Ekkyo Bungaku is, how many people that have been active in describing that have kind of deep roots or deep connections with poetry in particular. Imafuku Yuta, of course, is a poet, you know, and he wrote the book that you talked about, the book Archipelago, about the archipelagic thinking, with Yoshimasa Gozo, you know, one of Japan's most famous and best avant-garde writers. And so, like, you know, I just am interested in thinking about this. It seems to me like, you know, like writers of poetry have been kind of not overrepresented, but highly represented in the thinking about Ekkyo Bungaku. And so also too, you know, many of the people who are, you know, involved with Ekkyo Bungaku kind of like cross boundaries of genre themselves. And so I'm just trying to like sort my head around, wrap my head around the ways that that like, crossing borders of language and nationality can potentially be connected with borders of genre. I mean, obviously there's not like, overlap. There are plenty people like Hideo Levy, who, to the best of my knowledge, has never written a poem, but people even so comment about the poetic quality of his prose and so on. So I don't know. It's just a very open-ended question.
Yeah, no, I think poetry is so important. And yeah, I so Jeffrey's one of the people who, if I wasn't focusing on that early slide of kind of Ikkyo Bungaku writers, but this is I was really framing this in an earlier stage. But yeah, poetry is really, really interesting here, and it's something that, to my shame, I hadn't thought about in any depth. And actually, I'm aware that Foucault is a poet, but I've always read him more from the kind of the scholarly or kind of cultural theorist kind of perspective. But I do think, this idea that there's so many boundaries being blurred, and I just think that in order for it to kind of meet the demands of whether it's a publishing scene or whether it's, I mean, I know people have spoken about world literature and things like that from the perspective of the publishing machine. That's not really my bag. I'm much more interested in going to the text. So can't speak with extreme clarity on what it is that drives this. I mean, right now, of course, Japanese literature is going through a fantastic translation boom in many respects. There's so many translators who are active. There's so many new works coming out in translation. And I do think that, there's a lot of action, especially in promoting the work of women, both women writers and women translators. And Jeffrey's active in this as well, which is fantastic. A lot of it is contemporary. And I think that kind of how things end up translated and what gets chosen, I think is something that I don't go into, but I think in order for it to be able to be packaged in a certain way, potentially, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Ito's stuff kind of falls into maybe an avant-garde kind of, so there's ways in which, or they've established a certain level of recognition in readers already. I think that the difficulty, the trap that I see potentially is that, especially with this post 311 turn, there's texts that are going to fall through the gaps, and of course we can't aspire for every single text to be translated. There's probably some good reasons why some of them haven't been. But I do think that the nature in which translation is now kind of just taken for granted as what it actually means, is feeding those structures that keep text within certain categories. And I think poetry is probably a really important way in which that's going to be challenged, because poetry then plays with language in other ways, is my expectation. I mean, funnily enough, and this is something that I need to look at as well, Okinawa literature, actually prose fiction has kind of dropped away. But poetry is apparently the new thing on the Okinawa literary scene. So maybe writers are also catching wind of this, kind of the potentials within poetry to challenge boundaries of genre and category, as you say, because yes, there is a heavy bent on this in terms of prose fiction. But I still need to feel my way through all of these, because it's I'm really happy about so many of the developments that are going. So I'm always very reluctant to kind of talk of, it makes me kind of nervous to point at these things in case I'm misconstrued as kind of criticizing the work of writers and translators. And that's not the point. It's really about what's happening as Japanese literature as a product, or as a kind of, from the perspective of kind of within Japan as it's being put out as a cultural commodity, which cannot but help but have a national stamp on it. And I mean, as an example, Murakami Haruki, although kind of cited as one of the main, Murakami is all through Numano's work. In fact, so Numano Mitsuyoshi is a comparative literature scholar and also a scholar of Russian literature. So the first part of his book on Japanese world literature, and in fact, first section of his books, articles on shifting borders within Japanese literature, the first Japanese transborder writer who talks about is Dostoevsky. Because of the influence of that Dostoevsky's work on Murakami, and then it goes and kind of how, so there's all sorts of things going on with this, but Murakami obviously kind of is at the forefront of his arguments on how Japanese literature has become international and internationally acclaimed. But if you look at I had a slide actually, which I didn't use in the end. I don't know, maybe I can just share it very briefly, which is of the scene in the bookshop in Cambridge that greeted me when I took this position. And it's a kind of hybrid slide. There's a few things going on in it. So the left-hand slide is an article which was published by Stephen Snyder called The Murakami Effect. And Stephen Snyder is another renowned translator and scholar of Japanese fiction. But he talks about how kind of the machine that goes into Murakami and stuff is kind of potentially homogenizing Japanese literature in translation. And again, prose fiction being what he's talking about. And he talks about Mizumura, the writer who writes in both English and Japanese, as a kind of contrast to this, because if you start translating a bilingual text, which language, the obvious language that you can't translate a Japanese English text into is English, because then it's just all English and there's no difference, if that's the whole point. But the central picture is the local branch of Heifers. That was the Japanese literary section when I moved to Cambridge. And there's a Mishima, there's a Soseki, there's a lot of Murakami. But I also thought that these kind of covers of the Murakami novels in translation, they all plays on, I call it the 50 Shades of the Flag of the Rising Sun. There's a kind of a riff on the Japanese national flag, the red, the white, and by implication the black, and the circular motif. And that runs across all of these. And the right-hand side is a novel that's gained a great deal of interest and acclaim by a writer, Kawakami Mieko, translated as Breast and Eggs. This is actually based on 2 short stories which Kawakami wrote in Japanese, which she then rewrote into a singular novel for the purpose of the translation market. And on one hand, we see the development and the kind of attention being pushed towards female writers. This text happens to be translated by two men, but it's a renowned Japanese woman writer. But even there, I was struck by the front cover, because you've got a slightly kind of sun, like a Japanese flag motif, but obviously also related to the female body, to do with the text, the title, the nature of the text. And it has a stamp of approval by Murakami Haruki on there as well. So this is kind of the flip side. I mean, I'm, as I say, looking at the text, but I suppose I'm conscious that this is the big field, and what's happening at the level of the text, or the text that interests me, where would they find a way onto that bookshop, potentially, as one point of inquiry.
Brilliant. Thanks, Vicky. That's fascinating. And thank you, Jeffrey, for your question. I see you've got another, you just made another brief comment. Do you want to come back in? Sorry, Jeffrey, I'm conscious.
Yeah, you can do it.
Oh, I was just reading this book, and so I felt like I wanted to mention it. So it's called "Who Are." Is this backwards? Who are reading Murakami? It's actually it was a bit of a revelation to me, because it's like such an incredible detailed look at the ways that translators intervene in the Murakami phenomenon, and really how we're not actually reading Murakami at all. Like this kind of oh yeah, there we go. Yay. I don't know that so many people know this book yet, since it's very new, but it's such a fascinating translation studies kind of exploration that I wanted to mention it. That's all.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. That's brilliant. And thanks, Vicky. I'm conscious we're coming up to we've gone beyond where we said we would go.
That's all right.
But yeah, thank you. Fascinating discussion. And I just wanted to just thank Vicky first of all. Just again, virtual round of applause. Brilliant talk, and to thank everyone else for their wonderful questions and for contributing to the discussion. We've got a series of events coming up, which you can find on our website, which is modernlanguages.sas.ac.uk. So if you're interested in coming along to some of the other seminars in this series, then please do check out the website. And yeah, thank you very much. I'll leave you in peace to enjoy your evenings, or wherever you are in the world.